There are nights in Paris when the fog moves like a creature with a mind of its own, sliding between the shutters of the old houses near the Seine, coiling around the bridges, settling against the glass of the riverside cafes until every outline softens into a whisper. On one such night, Inspector Moreau found himself staring at a small wooden music box sitting on his desk at the Quai des Orfèvres. It was an ordinary object at first glance, varnished walnut with a faded floral engraving, the sort of trinket a grandmother might place on a bedroom vanity. Yet the box had arrived in the early hours, delivered by a trembling concierge from Rue des Trois Faucons, claiming it had begun to play on its own long after the household had gone to sleep. The melody, slow, distorted, and unmistakably deliberate, was said to echo through the rooms as if someone unseen were winding it, even though no hands were near. As Moreau listened to the concierge recount the tale, he noticed a faint scent rising from the box, a perfume reminiscent of a long-shuttered perfumerie on the boulevard de Sébastopol, something floral buried beneath years of dust and memory. Something in the man's voice, or perhaps in the way the fog pressed against the panes, suggested that whatever lay behind this strange occurrence was not merely a matter of mechanical malfunction. Paris had a habit of hiding truths in its shadows, and tonight one of them had chosen to announce itself with a single wavering tune. If stories born in the quiet corners of Paris intrigue you, those moments when a single object can unravel an entire night, then stay close. And if you wish to walk further with Inspector Moreau through these dim corridors of mystery, you may support this journey by liking, sharing, and subscribing. It helps keep these midnight tales alive, especially the ones that begin as softly as a music box, playing where no living hand should be. The morning that Inspector Moreau made his way to Rue des Trois Faucons began with a wind that seemed determined to sweep the remnants of the night off the streets. The fog had thinned only slightly, drifting in pale ribbons that clung to the gutters and doorsteps like half-remembered dreams refusing to dissolve with the daylight. Moreau pulled his coat tighter around his frame as he stepped from the cab at the corner, nodding to the driver in silent thanks. Even in these hours, the quarter still carried the hush of a world reluctant to wake, as though it preferred the safety of shadows to the clarity of morning. His breath steamed faintly in the damp air, merging with the faint smoke rising from nearby chimneys and the faint scent of bread still warm from the ovens of the neighborhood bakeries. He walked the short distance toward the house with the slow, steady gait of a man accustomed to early morning investigations. But there was something about this case that pressed differently upon him. Perhaps it was the manner in which the concierge had delivered the music box to the Quai des Orfèvres before dawn, palms trembling as though he handed over something alive. Or perhaps it was the lingering perfume that clung to the wood, suggesting a whisper of intimacy out of place in a household said to be quiet and respectable. Moreau had learned long ago that such small contradictions were often the cracks through which a deeper truth could be glimpsed. He took a final look at the facade before him, 3 stories of pale stone, the shutters closed except for one on the 3rd floor, and rang the bell. The door opened almost immediately, as though someone had been standing just beyond it, waiting for the sound. Madame Lenoir, tall and thin with silver hair gathered neatly at the nape of her neck, peered at him with a mixture of relief and apprehension. Her eyes were dark and quick, shifting from his face to the street behind him before she stepped aside and gestured him in. The interior of the house was warmer than he had expected, a faint smell of boiled coffee mingling with the musty scent of old curtains. Something in the air suggested a sleepless night, the kind that stains a room with quiet dread. Moreau wiped the moisture from his boots and removed his hat, acknowledging the woman with a respectful incline of his head as she led him through the narrow hallway. In the parlor, Elise Lenoir waited near the window, her hands clasped rigidly in front of her. She was younger than he had imagined from the concierge's account, perhaps in her late 20s with dark hair pulled back in a simple knot. Her posture was tense, her expression carefully composed, though the faint puffiness around her eyes betrayed the anxiety she attempted to hide. Moreau sensed that she was the kind of woman who rarely allowed herself to show fear, which made the tremor in her left hand all the more telling. On the sideboard beside her, wrapped in a cloth more delicate than necessary, sat the music box. For a moment, Moreau let his gaze rest on it. Its surface, though worn by age, retained a muted elegance, as though it had once belonged to someone with a keen eye for craftsmanship. The floral engraving, though faded, still suggested a patient hand and careful intention. The lid, a fraction misaligned, hinted at either recent mishandling or long-standing disrepair. Yet even from across the room, Moreau could detect the faint scent it emitted, an aroma reminiscent of lilies mixed with something more elusive, a perfume that carried echoes of years long vanished. It was not strong, but it was insistent, threading itself into the air like a memory attempting to reassert itself. Madame Lenoir motioned toward the settee with a gesture that was both hospitable and involuntary, as though following the practiced habits of polite society, even while her mind remained elsewhere. Moreau took his seat, placing his hat beside him, and waited for the women to settle opposite. He allowed the silence to stretch naturally for a moment, giving them the space to gather their thoughts. In his experience, silence was often more revealing than hurried questions. The parlor around them felt oddly suspended, as though the walls themselves were listening. "It played again last night," Madame Lenoir finally whispered, her voice thin and strained. "After midnight, we had all gone to bed. No one touched it. I'm certain of that." Elise's eyes flicked to the music box, then back to Moreau. "It began 3 nights ago," she said quietly. "We thought at first it might have been affected by the weather, moisture perhaps. But last night it felt deliberate." Moreau leaned slightly forward. "You heard it yourself?" She nodded, the movement small yet decisive. "The melody is faint at first, almost hesitant, and then it grows clearer. It is not a tune I recognize. It feels familiar somehow, but not in a way I can explain." The inspector studied the young woman's face, noting the mixture of confusion and something deeper, something she seemed unwilling to name. "And there were no visitors to the house? No disturbances of any kind?" "No," Madame Lenoir said quickly, too quickly for Moreau's liking. Elise's expression shifted ever so slightly, enough for him to catch the flicker of something withheld. He did not press, not yet. Instead, he rose from his seat and approached the music box with measured steps, careful not to startle either woman with sudden movements. He lifted the cloth with a gentleness that surprised even him, and examined the box more closely. The hinge was slightly rusted, though functional. The latch bore a faint scratch across its brass surface, as though someone had attempted to open it hurriedly in the dark. When he opened the lid, the scent intensified for a moment before dispersing again. The mechanism inside was simple, but finely crafted, though he noticed immediately that it had been tampered with at some point. A tiny screw had been replaced by one of a different size, and the cylinder bore an unnatural scrape along one side. "When did this box come into your possession?" he asked without looking up. Madame Lenoir hesitated. "It belonged to my late husband. He kept it in the attic for years. I found it only recently while searching for some papers." "And you do not recall it ever playing on its own before now?" "No," she said, but her voice carried the faintest waver. Moreau closed the box with a soft click, allowing the sound to settle in the room. He turned back toward the women. "May I see the attic where it was stored?" Madame Lenoir stiffened visibly, and Elise's eyes darted toward her mother in silent appeal. For a heartbeat, neither woman spoke. The tension hung between them like a thread stretched taut. "The attic is locked," Madame Lenoir finally said. "The key has been misplaced for years." It was Elise who broke the pretense. "Mother, please," she murmured, her voice pleading yet steady. Then, turning to Moreau, she added, We have not opened that room since my father died, but I believe there may be something there connected to all this." Moreau nodded slowly, acknowledging the courage it took for her to speak against her mother's reluctance. "Then I will need to see it, locked or not." Madame Lenoir's composure faltered. Her hands, resting in her lap, trembled almost imperceptibly. "Inspector, some doors are better left closed." Her words, though softly spoken, carried a weight that made the room seem suddenly colder. Moreau regarded her in silence, noting the layers of fear, guilt, and something like resignation settling in her expression. He had encountered such tones before, tones born not of superstition, but of secrets long buried. "Madame," he said gently, "doors left closed too long have a habit of opening themselves." Her eyes flickered toward the music box, and for the first time, Moreau sensed the depth of her dread. After a long moment, she nodded, defeated by forces she could not name. Elise rose, retrieving a small ring of keys from a drawer near the mantelpiece. "This one," she said, selecting a tarnished key and placing it in Moreau's hand. "It was hidden behind the clock. I believe my mother hoped it would remain forgotten." The inspector closed his fingers around the cold metal. He did not speak. Instead, he stepped back toward the music box, the house heavy around him like an exhale suspended in time. Somewhere above them, a floorboard creaked, though none of them had moved. Elise flinched. Madame Lenoir's face drained of color. Moreau slipped the key into his coat pocket. He did not yet know what lay behind the attic door, nor what ghosts, real or imagined, had been stirring the melody of the box. But he felt, unmistakably, the shifting of something beneath the surface of this quiet household, like the faint movement of water beneath a frozen river. He turned once more to the women, who now watched him with the uneasy hope one reserves for a doctor who has just touched the pulse of a long-hidden illness. "I will return shortly," he said, "and when I do, we will open that door." The fog outside pressed against the windows as though listening. By the time Inspector Moreau reached the Quai des Orfèvres again, the mist over the Seine had lifted into a thin, stubborn haze that dulled the edges of the city without fully obscuring them. The river moved slowly, heavy and opaque, like a thought that refused to arrive at a conclusion. He climbed the worn stone steps of the prefecture with the music box carefully wrapped in his coat, its slight weight a constant reminder at his side. The building itself exhaled the familiar mixture of ink, tobacco, damp wool, and stale coffee, a scent that had lodged itself permanently into its corridors and into the very idea of Parisian justice. Somewhere, a typewriter clacked with mechanical insistence. Somewhere else, a man coughed into the crook of his arm, the sound echoing briefly before being swallowed by the stone. In his office, a small room overlooking a narrow inner courtyard where laundry lines occasionally appeared despite regulations, Moreau placed the music box at the center of his desk as though it were a witness brought in for questioning. The early light, filtered through the dusty glass, fell across its varnished surface, picking out the faint scratches and worn edges that hinted at years of handling before the long sleep in the attic. He stood for a moment with his hands in his pockets, studying it the way he might study a suspect who had chosen silence as a defense. Then he pulled his chair closer and sat, reaching for his magnifying glass and a small notebook. The lid lifted with the same quiet resistance he had felt earlier at the Lenoir house. Inside, the mechanism gleamed thoughtfully. The cylinder's teeth were fine and closely spaced, some slightly bent, others worn smooth by repetition. The comb, though tarnished, remained delicate, each tine capable of carrying a note that might be pure if coaxed correctly. The small winding key had a slight nick at its base, as if someone had once gripped it too tightly in a moment of agitation. Moreau's gaze lingered on the inscription inside the lid. "To A, that our knights may always find their song." The handwriting had been elegant once, confident, but time or circumstance had made it tremble. The final flourish of the initial ended abruptly, as though the writer had been interrupted. He noted the inscription carefully in his notebook, along with the peculiarities of the mechanism, the replaced screw, the unnatural scrape along one side of the cylinder. These were not the marks of ordinary use. Someone had opened and altered this object, perhaps clumsily, perhaps in haste. Whether to preserve something or to conceal it, he could not yet tell. He turned the box slightly, noticing a faint discoloration near one of the hinges, a darkened patch in the wood that might have been caused by moisture or by the prolonged presence of something else pressed against it. The scent, lilies and a subtler, powdery undertone, seemed stronger here, as though it had seeped from within, rather than merely settled on the surface. There was a knock at the door, the brisk, familiar rhythm that needed no introduction. Janvier entered without waiting for an invitation, a file tucked under his arm and a half-smile at the corner of his mouth that faded when his eyes fell on the music box. He closed the door behind him with more care than usual. "So that is the famous ghost, is it?" he asked, his tone light but his gaze intent. "The thing that plays while its owners sleep and frightens old women more than unpaid bills." Moreau allowed a faint curve of amusement to touch his lips. "Sit, Janvier. Tell me something. Have you ever known a mechanism to repair itself in the dark?" Janvier lowered himself into the chair opposite and leaned forward, forearms resting on his knees. "Not unless it had very nimble fingers, patron, or a very determined hand nearby." "Why? Did our phantom wind it with a court order in hand?" Moreau turned the box so that the inscription faced Janvier. "Look," he said, "and tell me the first word that comes to mind." Janvier read the inscription silently, his brow furrowing. "A lover's gift," he said after a moment, "or something very close to it. To A, knights, song. It is not the sort of sentiment one writes to a niece." "Nor to a neighbor," Moreau added. "The widow Lenoir claims it belonged to her late husband, and that she found it in the attic only recently. She does not remember it playing before, but now it wakes the house after midnight as though it had never forgotten the time." Janvier pursed his lips. "You believe the old woman is hiding something?" "I believe," Moreau said slowly, "that the house on Rue des Trois Faucons has been living with a silence too carefully maintained, and when silence is strained, even a small melody can sound like a shout." He closed the lid and, after a brief pause, wound the box very gently, just enough to engage the cylinder no more. For a moment, nothing happened. Then a hesitant sound emerged, thin and wavering, like the first effort of a singer whose voice has grown rusty with disuse. The melody unfolded in a halting sequence of notes that did not quite resolve, each phrase reaching toward a conclusion that never came. The tune was simple, yet strangely insistent, as though it circled something it could not name. Janvier listened, his usual ironic expression replaced by a more thoughtful one. "It's not a popular song that I recognize," he said. "Too personal. There's something in the rhythm. It trips deliberately, like a man who limps but refuses to use a cane." "Someone told me once," Moreau murmured, half to himself, "that certain music boxes were crafted with more than entertainment in mind, that they could be made to carry patterns, codes, even messages. A story for children, perhaps, or a superstition for grown men who need excuses for obsession." Janvier smiled faintly. "I know a man in Montreux who restores old instruments. He swears he once saw a box that played a sequence matching an address. The client called it a coincidence. He called it a miracle. The truth was probably a bill he never paid." "The name Valacourt," Moreau said, letting the tune continue its stubborn circling, "means nothing to you?" Janvier tilted his head, thinking. "A musician, perhaps. It has that sound, but no, it does not ring any bell. Is it written somewhere?" "In letters found in the attic," Moreau replied. "Letters that should have been burned if someone truly wished to let the past rest. Instead, they were tied and hidden, which tells me whoever hid them could not bring themselves to destroy them, or did not have time. The melody faltered, one note catching awkwardly, then recovered, limping toward its unfinished refrain. Moreau reached out and stopped the cylinder with the tip of his finger. The abrupt silence that followed seemed louder than the music itself. He let it sit there a moment, thick and expectant, before speaking again. "I want you to visit this man in Montreuil," he said. "Ask him about boxes like this one. Who made them? Who bought them? Who brought them back broken, and why? Do not mention the Lenoirs by name. Say only that you are indulging an inspector's curiosity, which is true enough." Janvier nodded, already reaching for a pencil to jot down the address on a scrap of paper. "And if he tells me it's all a matter of rust and misalignment, then we will at least know which illusions we can discard," Moreau said. "But I doubt he will stop there. Men who live with old music tend to have old stories." Janvier stood, slipping the note into his pocket. At the door he paused. "You think this Valicour is still alive?" Moreau looked at the closed lid of the box, the faint perfume rising from it like a patient breath. "If he is," he replied, "then he chose a strange way to knock on a door he abandoned, and if he is not, someone else is knocking for him." After Janvier left, the office felt oddly larger, as though the absence of another body had given the room more space for its shadows. Moreau sat back, fingers interlaced, and allowed his mind to drift back to the Rue des Trois Faucons. He saw again Elise's pale face in the conservatory, her eyes averted from the attic door even when the conversation had moved on. He saw Madame Lenoir's hands trembling as she insisted the key was lost, the way her gaze had slid away when the music box was mentioned. These were not reactions to a mere household nuisance. They were reactions to a familiar ghost being called by name. A telegram lay on his desk, folded beneath a case report he had not yet opened. He had received it shortly before leaving for the Lenoir house, but had not taken the time to read it fully. Now he unfolded it and scanned the brief staccato lines. It was from Madame Lenoir, sent earlier that morning, before his arrival. In jerky phrases, it hinted that she had remembered something important about the music box, something connected with her husband's final weeks. But at the bottom, in a hurried scrawl added later, she had written, "Have reconsidered, perhaps of no relevance. Please disregard." The contradiction struck him as sharply as a shouted denial. Moreau set the telegram beside the box and studied them together. One was paper and ink, easily discarded. The other was wood and metal, difficult to ignore once it began to play. Yet both were testimonies of a sort. One spoke of a mind trying to retreat from its own memory. The other spoke of a past that refused to be kept silent. Between them lay the narrow bridge he would have to cross if he wished to understand what was truly being said. He rose and went to the window, looking down into the courtyard where a clerk in a worn overcoat was shaking out a rug with more vigor than efficiency. Beyond the courtyard, the roofs of Paris stretched in uneven lines under the pale sky, chimneys rising like mute witnesses. Somewhere in that tangle of streets, perhaps in a small cafe on a corner that had once heard a certain melody played on a piano late at night, there were people who still remembered Adrian Valicour, or thought they did. Memory, Moreau knew, was as prone to embellishment as it was to omission. He turned back to the desk and, after a moment's hesitation, opened the box again. This time he did not wind it. He merely observed the arrangement of pins on the cylinder, the spacing of the comb's tines. There was, he thought, a pattern here beyond the obvious, a repetition too deliberate to be merely musical. It might have been nothing more than his imagination, colored by Janvier's anecdote and the whispers of old restorers. Yet he had learned over the years that imagination, when tempered by caution, could be a useful tool. It allowed a man to see the outlines of possibilities before evidence gave them weight. He snapped the lid shut gently and slid the box to one side. There was work to be done before he returned to Rue des Trois Faucons. He would speak to a clerk at the archives about any mention of Valacourt. He would have someone discreetly inquire at the cafes and small theatres where musicians of modest reputation lingered in the evenings. And he would, perhaps most importantly, give Madame Lenoir a little time to sit with the knowledge that the attic would soon be opened. Time had a way of turning fear into speech. For now, the music box remained silent on his desk, its secret intact, its melody coiled like a sleeping snake. The quiet in the office grew dense around it, but Moreau sensed that this was only a pause in the story, not its end. Sooner or later, he knew, it would play again. The sky had already begun to dim by the time Inspector Moreau returned to Rue des Trois Faucons, though the day was only half spent. A heavy veil of cloud had crept in from the outskirts of the city, painting the air with a muted grey that made the lamps flicker prematurely along the narrow street. The house stood as it had before. 3 stories of quiet stone, shutters drawn like eyelids refusing to open, but the sense of stillness around it felt sharper now, taut as a thread pulled too tightly. Moreau paused at the gate, noticing the faint indentation in the gravel walk that suggested someone had stood there recently, lingering long enough to shift their weight. Rain from the late morning had settled into small puddles, each holding a trembling reflection of the house, as though unsure what shape it ought to mirror. He rang the bell only once. Footsteps approached quickly from within, lighter than those of Madame Lenoir, and when the door opened, it was Elise who stood before him. Her face was drawn, and though she attempted to mask it with polite composure, her eyes betrayed the weight of a sleepless night. She stepped aside silently, motioning him in with a subtle urgency that did not resemble mere courtesy. The hallway was dimmer than before, the curtains drawn tighter, the shadows stretched longer across the patterned carpet. It took Moreau only a moment to notice that Madame Lenoir was nowhere in sight. Elise walked ahead with a determined pace he had not seen in her earlier tremulous demeanor, and he followed her through the parlor without stopping. She did not speak until she reached the door of the conservatory, her hand hovering above the brass handle as though unsure whether to open it. "She's resting," Elise said quietly. "Mother has not been well since you left. She insisted on preparing lunch, but could barely keep her hand steady. I asked her to lie down for a moment." She hesitated, then added, "I wanted to speak to you alone." Moreau inclined his head in acknowledgement. "Very well." She opened the conservatory door, and a faint draught brushed against them. The glass walls, streaked with moisture from the passing rain, cast shifting reflections across the tiled floor, while the plants inside, mostly ferns and a few wilted lilies, stood in silent disarray. At the far end, through the glass, the courtyard was visible. Leaves matted by rain, the stone darkened to near black. Elise moved to the windowsill and rested her hands upon it, her posture rigid. For a long moment, she said nothing. The inspector waited with the patience that years of interrogations had taught him, allowing her to find her own path into the confession she had summoned him to hear. When she finally spoke, her voice was low but steady, as though she had rehearsed this moment many times in her mind. "I lied to you earlier," she said. "Not entirely, but enough that it has troubled me since. There is something I should have told you the moment you asked about the music box." Moreau stepped nearer, though not too close. "Go on." She turned her face toward him, the faint light catching the sheen in her eyes. "This is not the first time I've heard that melody." She paused, her breath catching on the next words. "I heard it when I was a child, the same notes, the same hesitant rhythm, and it came from behind the attic door." The inspector felt the sentence settle into the air like an object of weight. Elise looked down at her hands, twisting one finger anxiously around the other. "I must have been 8 or 9, she continued. "I woke one night to the sound of something faint, almost like the first drops of rain on a window, but melodic. I remember thinking someone had come into my room and was playing a toy. I got out of bed and went into the hallway. Mother was standing outside the attic door, her back to me. She looked paralyzed, as though the very sound had rooted her to the spot. She didn't notice me until the melody stopped. Then she turned and told me I had imagined it. She made me promise never to speak of it again. Moreau absorbed her words in silence, noting the childlike clarity with which she recalled the moment. Memories from childhood often arrived softened or distorted, but hers seemed sharpened by years of quiet fear. "You believed her?" he asked softly. "At the time," Elise said, "children believe what they are told to believe, but as I grew older, I realized she had been lying. Something in her face, something she couldn't hide, told me she knew exactly what the melody was, and exactly why it frightened her." She moved away from the window then, pacing a few steps before stopping near the small table where a pot of tea sat cooling, untouched. She reached for it, then seemed to think better of it and let her hand fall to her side. "When the box played again this week," she continued, "the sound was so familiar it felt like a dream returning after years of silence. But I told myself I was imagining things, just as she once told me. I tried to believe it, until yesterday." Moreau raised an eyebrow, encouraging her to go on. "Yesterday morning," Elise whispered, "I went upstairs to fetch linens from the cupboard near the attic. I told myself I would not look at the door, but I did anyway. There were footprints in the dust. Fresh ones. Too large to be mine, too sharp to be old." She swallowed, her voice tightening. "And the door, I swear to you, Inspector, it was not fully closed." The faint click of a branch tapping against the conservatory glass startled neither of them, but it underscored the tension that had settled around Elise's confession. Moreau considered her carefully, weighing the sincerity in her voice, the careful detail with which she described each recollection. Elise was frightened, certainly, but her fear did not strike him as fantastical. Rather, it bore the shape of something long denied, now forcing its way back into daylight. "Why tell me this now?" he asked gently. "Because," Elise said, "something else happened last night, something I cannot explain." She moved to the center of the room, clasping her hands tightly as though holding them together prevented her composure from slipping apart. The melody woke me again, sometime after midnight. It was soft at first, but clearer than it had been the night before. I got out of bed and went into the hallway. Mother's door was shut, but I could hear her moving restlessly inside, as if she were trying not to hear the sound. I walked toward the stairs, and each step felt heavier than the last. When I reached the landing outside the attic, the melody stopped. She took a slow, unsteady breath. But that wasn't the worst of it. When I turned to go back downstairs, I felt... She hesitated, her fingers trembling, as if someone was standing just behind me. Not close enough to touch, but close enough that I could feel the shift in the air. I turned around immediately. There was no one. The hallway was empty. But the scent... Her voice faltered. The same perfume the box gives off. Lilies and powder. It was there, as clearly as if someone had walked past me. Moreau said nothing for a long moment. Not because he doubted her, but because her words aligned too precisely with the things he had already observed. The perfume inside the lid, the faint discoloration on the wood, the trembling script of the inscription. There were pieces here, scattered but compatible, waiting only for the right hand to fit them together. "Elise," he said finally, "your mother, does she know you're telling me this?" A flash of guilt crossed her face. "No. She wouldn't approve. She would say I'm imagining everything again, or that I'm making trouble where none exists. But she's afraid, Inspector. She's more afraid now than I've ever seen her. And fear makes people cling to silence, even when silence is dangerous." Her gaze fixed on him, searching for certainty. "I just want the truth," she whispered. "Whatever it is. I can feel it pressing against this house like a storm waiting to break." Moreau nodded slowly. "Then we will face it together, but you must trust me, even when what we uncover is not what you expect." A tear slipped quietly down her cheek, though she brushed it away before it could fall fully. "I do trust you," she said. The inspector stepped back, allowing the weight of her confession to settle fully between them. Outside, the first drops of rain began tapping softly against the glass, a quiet percussion that echoed the faint, hesitant rhythm of the melody that had brought him here. He glanced toward the staircase as though expecting to see the attic door from where he stood. "Elise," he said gently, "I will need that key." Her expression tightened, but she nodded. From the pocket of her dress, she withdrew a small, tarnished key. The same one she had given him earlier, yet now its presence seemed heavier, charged with all she had confessed. He accepted it without a word. As he slipped the key into his coat, the rain intensified, drumming steadily against the conservatory roof. The house felt smaller now, as though the walls had shifted inward, compressing the air around them. "Elise," he murmured, "there is something else you haven't told me, isn't there?" Her breath caught. She looked toward the staircase, her eyes darkening. "Yes," she whispered, "but it's something I'm not sure I understand myself." Another moment passed, thick, tense, alive with unsaid things, before she met his gaze again. "Tonight," she murmured, "I'll show you." Her words lingered in the air like the last fading notes of a melody. The rain had not stopped for hours. It drummed steadily upon the slate roof of Rue des Trois Faucons, thickening the air inside the house until every room felt dense with dampness and expectation. When Inspector Moreau returned that evening, the street lights glowed weakly against the downpour, their halos trembling in the wet air like lanterns seen through tears. He paused again at the gate, listening. The house before him seemed to exhale slowly, as though gathering itself for whatever was about to unfold. Moreau tightened his coat and stepped inside. Elise answered the door almost as soon as he knocked, her face pale, her hair pinned hastily back. This time she did not guide him through the hallway or offer him a seat in the parlor. Instead, she spoke in a hushed, breathless tone, the way one speaks in a house where someone sleeps uneasily or where someone unseen might be listening. "She's in her room," Elise whispered. "She hasn't come downstairs since this afternoon. I think she knows what you intend to do." Moreau nodded, neither reassuring nor dissuading her. He glanced toward the staircase. The shadows there were thicker than he remembered, as though dusk had settled only on the upper floor. Elise led him to its foot, each step creaking with the house's weary age. When they reached the landing, she stopped and placed a hand lightly on his arm. "Before we go up," she said, "you should know something. After you left this afternoon, I went to the attic door again. I told myself I wouldn't, but I couldn't stop thinking about the footprints. I just wanted to see if they were still there, and when I reached the landing—" She paused, her fingers trembling. "The door was closed. Completely. The footprints were gone." Moreau's eyes narrowed slightly. "Gone? As though someone had swept them away," she whispered. "But I didn't hear a thing, not a single sound from upstairs." He did not answer at once. His mind moved through the possibilities, some logical, some less so, but he filed them away for later. He thanked her quietly and moved past her, one hand resting lightly on the banister as he ascended. Elise followed at a slight distance, her steps hesitant. Upstairs, the hallway held the faint scent of lilacs, mingled with something older. Dust, mothballed fabric, stale paper. The scent was gentle but unmistakable, and Moreau felt a quiet tightening in his chest. Elise noticed it too. She inhaled slowly, a shiver running through her. "It wasn't here earlier," she murmured. The attic door stood at the far end. A simple wooden panel painted in a color that might once have been cream, but had long since faded into a sickly yellow-gray. A portrait hung to its right, a woman in a high-collared dress, seated beside a piano, her expression fixed in a way that suggested resignation rather than pride. Moreau noted her eyes, soft, wistful, with a hint of melancholy. Her signature at the bottom was barely legible, but he recognized the shape of the initial A to A. The inscription in the music box had read. Moreau approached the door slowly, the key heavy in his pocket. Elise remained a few steps behind him, her breaths shallow. "Are you ready?" he asked. She nodded, though the movement was tiny. He withdrew the key and inserted it into the lock. It slid in more smoothly than he expected, as though the door had been unlocked recently or oiled without his knowledge. The lock turned with a soft click, too soft for a door unopened in years. Elise flinched. Moreau pushed the door open. The attic was cold. Not the normal chill of an unused room, but the deeper cold of a place long sealed, where air stagnates and lingers like an unspoken thought. The faint scent of lilacs intensified the moment they entered, as if released by the disturbance of the door. The room stretched long beneath the sloping roof, its walls lined with old trunks, stacks of boxes, and pieces of furniture draped in sheets. A single, narrow window near the far end admitted only a weak, watery glow. Moreau stepped inside with deliberate caution, not because he feared what might be waiting, but because he respected the tension that pressed against the room's silence. Elise followed, stopping just inside the threshold, her fingers gripping the door frame. The inspector's eyes moved first to the center of the room, where the rusted iron bed frame stood. A thin mattress lay atop it, covered with a yellowing sheet. A faint indentation cut into the center of the fabric, subtle but unmistakable. It was the mark of weight, recent, unmistakable, human. Elise drew a sharp breath. "I didn't imagine that," she whispered. "No," Moreau said softly. "You did not." He approached the mattress and crouched beside it. His fingers hovered over the indentation, feeling the faint residual coolness beneath the sheet. Someone had indeed sat there, perhaps not long ago. The weight had been neither light nor heavy. A woman, perhaps, or a slight man. He rose and turned his attention to the writing desk against the wall. Its surface was coated in dust except for a small rectangular space where something had recently rested. Moreau traced the outline with the tip of his finger. "A box," he murmured, "roughly the size of the one downstairs." Elise swallowed. "So it was kept here." "Or returned here," Moreau corrected. He opened the desk drawer. Inside lay sheets of old paper, some blank, others containing fragments of musical notation, bars of melody, incomplete phrases, small corrections in the margins. Most were unfinished. The melody he had heard earlier flickered through his mind. He spread a few of the sheets across the desk. The notes matched the hesitant progression of the music box's tune, though the lines were fractured and uncertain. They seemed to represent a composition interrupted mid-thought, as though the composer had been unable to complete what they had begun. "One of these hands," Moreau said, tapping lightly at the most confident strokes, "belongs to a trained musician." Elise came closer, studying the pages with a mixture of wonder and dread. "But who? My father played no instrument. Mother only practiced piano when I was very young." Moreau did not respond immediately. His attention had shifted to a trunk positioned near the foot of the bed. It hung slightly ajar, a gap of a few centimeters revealing the edge of fabric. White lace, delicate and old. He knelt and lifted the lid. Inside lay garments wrapped in tissue paper, dresses yellowed by time, gloves, silk scarves, and beneath them, a flat wooden case. Moreau lifted it out carefully. Dust clung to the surface, but the case itself was well crafted, polished once to a dark gleam. He opened it. Inside lay a violin. The instrument showed signs of age, but it had been cared for once. The varnish glowed faintly even in the dim light. A name had been carved discreetly near the base, barely visible beneath a layer of dust. A. Valacourt. Elise gasped. "That name, yes," Moreau said quietly. "The same one from the letters." He examined the violin more closely. A thin ribbon of fabric had been tied around the neck of the instrument, pale blue, worn at the edges. It carried the same faint scent as the music box. Under the violin, resting in the case's velvet lining, lay a folded slip of paper. Moreau retrieved it and unfolded it slowly. The handwriting was the same trembling script he had seen inside the music box lid. "For the nights we lost, for the nights we may yet reclaim." The words trembled in the air like a confession. "Elise," Moreau said, turning toward her, "your mother must have known the violin was here." Elise pressed a hand to her mouth, but she never said a word. Moreau stood, the violin case still open beside him. His mind pieced together the fragments, the inscription, the unfinished musical notation, the presence of another's belongings, hidden carefully but never destroyed. This was no casual acquaintance. Whoever Adrien Vallecourt had been, he had been someone deeply entwined in the Lenoir household's past, far more deeply than Madame Lenoir had admitted. Moreau closed the violin case gently. "Elise," he said, "there is something else." She turned, trembling. "What?" He pointed toward the window. The glass was faintly fogged from within, not from their breath, but from something earlier, and in the condensation, traced with a single finger, was a shape, a curve, a short line, the beginning of a musical note. Elise backed away, her breath catching in her throat. "Inspector, who could have—" A sudden thump interrupted her. Not from below, but from the far end of the attic. Something shifting. Something small, but undeniable. Moreau raised a hand, motioning her to stay back. He moved forward carefully, every sense sharpened. The shadows there seemed deeper, pressed into the corners, like living things reluctant to move. He reached a stack of trunks and paused. Then, a soft sound, a whisper of wood brushing against wood, as if someone had just stepped aside or slipped away. "Elise," he said quietly, "go downstairs. Bring your mother to the parlor. I will follow." "What is it?" she whispered. He did not answer. He waited until her footsteps retreated down the stairs. Only then did he speak into the stillness. "I know you're here." The attic gave no reply, but the perfume in the air grew stronger. Inspector Moreau did not leave the attic immediately. He stood in the half-darkness, his eyes lingering on the stacks of trunks and shadowed corners, where the faintest movement might be mistaken for something living. The house was silent save for the muted percussion of the rain against the roof. Yet the air felt disturbed, not by a gust of wind or a shifting draft, but by a presence that had chosen to remain unseen. Moreau had spent years investigating human beings, their habits, their anxieties, the ways they tried to conceal their secrets. But there were moments, rare though they were, when a crime scene carried a stillness not quite linked to guilt or fear, but to memory itself, memory that clung to walls like old wallpaper. The attic of Rue des Trois Faucons had that quality, a room left untouched too long and now awakened by hands no one admitted to. He examined the floorboards once more. The dust had been disturbed in several places. Some smudges bore the crescent impression of a shoe, but faintly, as though the intruder had tried to place each step with careful precision. One mark in particular caught his attention, a sharp edge near the heel, unlike the rounded contours of a typical city boot. It looked almost like the imprint of a walking stick's metal tip accidentally brushing the wood. He crouched down, touched it lightly, and inhaled the faint scent of moisture clinging to it. Whatever, or whoever, had been here had not remained long, but the sense of departure was almost palpable, like the closing note of a song left unfinished. He closed the attic door behind him and descended the stairs slowly, careful not to break the fragile quiet settling over the house. When he reached the parlor, Elise stood near the mantelpiece, wringing her hands nervously. Madame Lenoir sat stiffly on the edge of an armchair, her face drained of color. The fire had gone out, leaving only a few glowing embers crackling softly. Elise rushed toward him. "Did you find someone? Did you see anything?" Moreau shook his head gently. "Nothing definite, but there were signs that someone has been up there recently." He turned to Madame Lenoir. "Madame, I must ask you plainly. Was Adrien Vallecourt ever in this house?" The widow's eyes widened. She inhaled sharply, her grip on the armchair tightening. For a handful of seconds she seemed frozen, her gaze fixed on the inspector with something between fear and defiance. Elise looked from her mother to Moreau, confusion and dawning realization mixing painfully on her face. "Mother," Elise murmured, "please, tell him." Madame Lenoir exhaled, a faint whistle escaping her lips. "Adrien Vallecourt should never have come to Paris," she whispered. "He shouldn't have crossed our doorstep. But he did, and when he left, he took something from us." Moreau leaned forward slightly. "What did he take?" She raised her hand as though physically shielding herself from memory. "That man brought ruin wherever he went. He was charming, yes, and talented, undeniably. Your father admired him too much, and I—" She stopped, her voice trembling. "I never wanted my daughter to know any of this." Elise stepped closer. "Know what, mother?" Madame Lenoir pressed her fingers to her temples, as though steadying her thoughts. "The music box was his, not your father's. He gave it to me, long before your father knew who he truly was." Moreau watched the flicker of shame cross her features. Elise's face, however, shifted not with shock but with something like recognition, as though she had suspected this for years and only lacked the words to articulate it. "He left the box with me," Madame Lenoir continued. "During the last winter he spent in Paris. He was staying in a boarding house near Montreuil, performing in those small cafes where musicians gather in the evenings. He said the box contained a melody he had been working on for years, a melody meant to bind two people together." Her lips thinned. "He made everything sound like poetry. That was his talent." "And did it?" Moreau asked softly. "Bind two people?" She closed her eyes. "For a time." Elise gasped quietly, her hand rising to her mouth. Moreau did not move, allowing the confession to spill naturally, like a wound finally drained. "At first it was harmless," Madame Lenoir said. "Your father was often away on business. Vallecourt had a way of making one forget one's loneliness. But when your father returned early one evening and heard the melody, when he recognized that the box was not his, everything changed. They argued. I do not know what was said, only that your father wanted Vallecourt gone." Her eyes darkened. "And he left. But he did not go willingly. There was bitterness in him, a bitterness that frightened me more than anything else." Moreau exchanged a brief glance with Elise, who looked hollow, as though pieces of her childhood were shifting under her feet. "And after he left?" the inspector asked. "A few months later," Madame Lenoir said, "your father fell ill. His heart, the doctor said. But I saw him, night after night, pacing the hallway beneath the attic, as though he heard something no one else could. When he died, I locked everything of Vallecourt's in the attic. The violin, the letters, the box. I wanted to believe that closing that door would close everything else. But I was wrong." Silence spread slowly through the room, thick and brittle. Outside, the rain had eased into a continuous drizzle, gentle but insistent. Elise sank into the nearest chair. "Why didn't you tell me any of this?" she whispered. "Why keep it hidden for so long?" Madame Lenoir bowed her head. "Because I wanted you to grow without the weight of your mother's mistakes." Moreau let the confession settle before speaking again. "Madame Lenoir, earlier today you wiped away the footprints outside the attic door. Why?" She started. I didn't want Elise frightened any more than she already was." "And what frightened you?" Moreau pressed. She hesitated, then looked toward the window as though expecting something to appear in the darkness beyond. I thought I thought I saw him. Elise jerked upright. Who? Madame Lenoir's voice fell to a whisper. Valancourt, at dawn yesterday. He was standing at the gate, watching the house, just as he used to. She closed her eyes tightly, and then he vanished, as if swallowed by the fog. Moreau felt a chill trace its way down his spine, though he restrained his expression. You are certain it was him? No, she said, her voice breaking. I cannot be certain, but the shape, the posture, the height, there are some silhouettes one never forgets. Another silence, this one carved by tension rather than grief. Moreau rested a hand on the back of a chair. Madame Lenoir, there is something else you must know. The attic was not empty when I entered it. Her eyes opened wide. Fear swallowed the last of her composure. What do you mean? He glanced toward the staircase. There was someone there. Someone who left moments before Elise and I entered. I cannot say who, but they were familiar enough with the room to move quietly, confidently, without disturbing more than they intended. Elise rose from her seat, her breath coming quickly. Inspector, who could it have been? We will determine that, he said calmly. But for now, I need both of you to lock your doors tonight, and I will return before dawn. Whoever is moving through this house is not a stranger. They know its history, its shadows, and its music. He reached for his coat. As he stepped toward the door, Madame Lenoir whispered, Inspector, do you believe he's alive? Moreau paused with his hand on the doorknob. I believe, he said quietly, that some men never leave entirely, even when Paris tries to forget them. He opened the door and stepped into the damp evening, and though the street was empty, Moreau had the distinct sensation that he was being watched. Inspector Moreau returned to the Quai des Orfèvres, with the rain clinging to him like a persistent shadow. He shed his coat and hat with deliberate slowness, setting them on the rack near his office door, as though each gesture could help him sort the thoughts pressing at his mind. The corridor outside hummed with the subdued activity of clerks finishing their day's work, the soft rattle of typewriters, the shuffle of papers, the occasional cough echoing faintly off the stone. But inside his office, once the door closed with a quiet snap, the world narrowed into two essential elements. The music box resting on his desk and the folded letters he had brought from the attic. He lit the lamp. The warm glow spilled across the room, pushing back the gray of the evening and revealing the travel-worn envelope that sat atop the stack of documents. He reached for it, careful not to disturb the fragile paper, and unfolded the first of the letters. Adrien Valancourt's handwriting was unmistakable, elegant, fluid, and marked with a peculiar artistic impatience, as though the words flowed faster than the hand could control. Moreau skimmed the opening lines, recognizing immediately the tone of a man writing not for posterity, but for the intimate solitude of a woman he believed understood him. He had seen such letters before. Love letters, confessions, pleas, all written in the privacy of vulnerability. The first letter spoke of music, of nights spent composing in a dimly lit room near Montreuil, of a melody that refused to leave him. But beneath the poetic rumination, a tension pulsed, an unease that bled into each sentence. Valancourt mentioned a quarrel with a fellow musician, hinted at debts owed, and alluded to some unnamed fear that chased him through the narrow streets of Paris. Moreau leaned back, absorbing the cadence of the words. The man was clearly gifted, musically, emotionally, perhaps dangerously so. There was sincerity threaded through the lines, but also something restless. He could almost hear the hesitation in Valancourt's pen strokes, the stops and starts that marked the edges of a confession he never managed to finish. The second letter shifted tone abruptly. It was shorter, written with uneven strokes, as if rushed. Valancourt seemed agitated, speaking of someone following him, someone determined to silence a melody that was never theirs to claim. He mentioned being watched outside a cafe on Rue Saint-Bernard, a cracked lantern swaying on a carriage that passed him twice in the same hour. The paranoia in the words was palpable, or had it been paranoia? Moreau felt a prickle along the back of his neck. A cracked lantern, a carriage passing twice, a man lingering at the gate of Rue des Trois Faucons. Threads, he thought. Threads woven across years, finally tugging loose. He set the letter aside and reached for the third, an unfinished one Elise must never have read. The ink had smudged in places, as though tears or rain had struck the paper during writing. Vallecourt addressed it to M. He did not specify more. Monsieur Madame Lenoir. He wrote of regret, deep, aching regret, and fear. A fear that he would be forced to leave Paris under dangerous circumstances. If I cannot claim what is mine, the letter read, then I will leave something behind that only you will understand. And if one day it sings again, you will know I kept my promise. Moreau paused, his pulse steady but heavy. The melody. The promise. The attic. He closed the letter carefully and fixed his gaze on the music box. Its varnished surface glimmered in the lamplight as though it held more than wood and metal inside. He lifted it gently and opened the lid. The faint perfume rose again. Lilies and powder, a fragrance now unmistakably linked not with the present, but with the memory of someone who once lived and breathed intensely within these notes. He wound the box once, just once. The melody began, soft and wavering, but this time Moreau listened not as a detective, but as a man trying to understand the ghost of another's heart. The irregularities in the tune were clearer now. Small pauses, deliberate hesitations, a rhythm that felt less accidental and more encoded, like a message pressed into music. He closed his eyes. A name. The letters. The violin. The attic. The woman whose portrait hung beside the attic door. Adrien Vallecourt had not been a passing presence in Madame Lenoir's life. He had been something far more entwined, more dangerous, more intimate. A ghost she had tried to bury with a key and a locked door, but ghosts, Moreau knew, rarely stayed buried. He opened his eyes as a knock sounded at the door. Janvier entered, rain dripping from the brim of his hat. He shook it off with an indelicate motion, earning a mild look of annoyance from his superior before tossing the hat onto the coat rack. "I spoke with that instrument maker in Montreux," Janvier said, pulling a chair toward the desk. He remembered Vallecourt. Moreau raised an eyebrow. "Go on." "Said he was brilliant. Moody. Prone to disappearing for days. Came to him once claiming someone had taken a melody from him, a melody he swore he'd poured his soul into. Said he'd hidden proof of his authorship in a wooden heart." Whatever that means. Moreau's gaze shifted to the music box. A wooden heart indeed. "And the rumors?" he asked. Janvier shrugged. "Depends who you ask. Some said Vallecourt left Paris to avoid his creditors. Others said he fled a woman's husband, though no one seemed to agree which woman. But the oldest rumor came from a bartender who swore that Vallecourt had been involved in something darker, something involving a coded message hidden in a composition, a message some very serious men wanted back. Moreau's expression didn't change, but Janvier noticed the subtle tightening around his mouth. "What sort of message?" Moreau asked. The man didn't know, or pretended not to, but he claimed Vallecourt believed the melody could expose something that would ruin people with power. Silence settled between them. Moreau rose and paced once around the room, his hands clasped behind his back. "Janvier, find out everything you can about Vallecourt in the weeks before his disappearance. Names he visited, debts he owed, cafes he frequented, anyone who might have wanted him quiet." "And the Lenoir?" Janvier asked. Moreau paused, his back to him. "A family keeping secrets seldom keeps them alone. I need to understand who else knew about Vallecourt's connection to that house." Janvier nodded. "And you, patron? What will you do?" Moreau's eyes drifted once more to the music box. "I will return to Rue des Trois Faucons," he said quietly. "Because if Valacour left a message in this melody, someone else may be listening for it too." Janvier hesitated, then asked, "You believe the man Madame Lenoir saw was him?" Moreau turned, his expression unreadable. "Either Valacour has returned, or someone is walking in his footsteps." The rain intensified outside, tapping insistently against the window like fingers drumming a rhythm. The same hesitant rhythm, the same imperfect melody. Moreau snapped the lid of the music box shut. "I need to hear what the house has to say before morning." He took his coat. As he stepped into the night, the fog rising from the river curled around him like a whisper trying to form words. Words carried by a tune long forgotten, a tune now stirring the shadows of Paris. Paris had entered one of those sullen spells of weather that seemed to weigh upon the city like a brooding thought. For 3 days, rain had fallen in varying temperaments. Sometimes a steady curtain, sometimes a fine mist that blurred the contours of the boulevards, and sometimes a sudden downpour that rattled windows and startled pigeons from their perches. By the time Inspector Moreau stepped out into the evening gloom, the cobblestones of the left bank glistened beneath the flickering glow of the gas lamps, each puddle a trembling mirror of the city above it. The air carried a scent of wet stone, coal smoke, and something faintly metallic, as though the rain had washed old memories from the rooftops and left them hanging in the atmosphere. He walked along the Quai de la Tournelle, collar raised, hat brim shielding him from the stubborn drizzle. The Seine moved sluggishly beside him, swollen by the continuous rainfall, its surface trembling with the patter of droplets. The weight of the letters he had studied earlier still pressed at his thoughts, merging with the lingering fragrance of lilies that clung to the music box, now nestled safely in his coat. Every step he took felt bound to a rhythm, slow, uneven, hauntingly familiar. A rhythm not unlike the melody that had begun to follow him in subtle ways. It started innocently enough. As he passed a narrow alley near Rue des Anglais, he heard someone humming, a man sitting on a crate beneath a tattered awning, stirring a pot of chestnuts over a brazier. The tune was off-key, yet the shape of it echoed the wavering pattern of the music box. The man didn't seem aware of it. He hummed absently, eyes half closed, lost in his own world. But the melody was unmistakable. Moreau paused, listening. When he approached to ask where the man had learned it, the humming ceased abruptly, as though the melody had simply evaporated. The man blinked up at him, startled by his presence. "What song were you humming just now?" Moreau asked. The man frowned. "Song? I wasn't humming anything, monsieur. Must have been the wind." Moreau thanked him and moved on, though his pulse had quickened slightly. Wind did not hum melodies, yet he had heard it clearly. An hour later, near Pont Neuf, he encountered a child playing a tin whistle, coaxing out a thin, reedy tune with admirable concentration, despite the damp cold. The notes drifted through the damp air, uncertain but determined. Again, the resemblance to the music box's melody struck Moreau with chilling clarity. The child, when asked where he had learned it, shrugged. "I don't know, monsieur. It just came to me." Like a memory resurfacing, or a message hidden in plain hearing. But the most unsettling moment came at a small cafe near Rue de Seine. Moreau stopped in for warmth and a cup of black coffee, the kind that could hold the chill at bay for half an hour. The cafe was modest, filled with the soft murmur of conversation and the subdued clink of cups. A man in a grey coat sat at the rear table, sketching in a notebook. An elderly woman read the newspaper. A pair of students whispered animatedly near the fogged window. All ordinary. Until the door opened and a man stepped in, soaked from the rain, his coat hanging heavy from his shoulders. He shook himself like a dog coming in from the river and moved directly to the bar. His face was partly obscured by the collar of his coat, but Moreau saw the pallor of his cheeks, the way his hands trembled slightly as he asked for a glass of wine. And then he began to whistle, softly at first, barely audible beneath the hum of conversation. But the tune, there it was again, note for note, each hesitation placed precisely where the music box faltered. The room seemed to contract, sound narrowing around the melody. Moreau froze, hand tightening around his cup. He watched the man with calculated stillness. The whistle was not tuneful. It rasped faintly, like breath through a cracked reed. But the pattern was unmistakable. When the inspector rose to approach, the whistling stopped. The man turned slightly, revealing only a partial profile, a sharp jawline, a shadow of stubble, eyes that glinted with something unreadable. He tossed a few francs onto the counter and stepped back toward the door. Moreau followed him outside. The man walked briskly toward the river, rain slicking his hair against his forehead. Moreau kept a respectful distance, careful not to alert him but determined to understand who he was. The melody repeated in his mind like an echo. The man quickened his pace near the bridge. Moreau closed the distance. "Excuse me," he called. The man didn't turn. Instead, he slipped beneath the archway of the bridge, where the shadows were denser, the sound of rain louder. Moreau followed, but when he stepped into the archway, he found nothing. The man had vanished. The only sound was the rushing of the swollen river and the rain hammering against the stones. Moreau stood there for a long moment, breathing steadily. The darkness held no clues, no footprints, no lingering silhouette. The man had disappeared too quickly for a casual pedestrian, yet too quietly for someone trying to flee a pursuit. It was as if he had dissolved into the rain. Later, when Moreau returned to his office, he pressed his hands to the desk and closed his eyes. The melody pulsed behind his eyelids like an afterimage. Janvier entered without knocking. "You've been out walking the entire city," Janvier said, shrugging off his coat. "You look like you've soaked yourself clear through." Moreau didn't respond immediately. Then he spoke, voice low. "They're humming it everywhere, Janvier. Children, vagrants, strangers. The tune." Janvier raised an eyebrow. "Coincidence?" "No." Moreau opened the music box and let a few notes play. The cylinder stumbled in its familiar way. "It's too specific. I heard it 4 times today." Janvier studied him, the levity slipping from his face. "You think Valacourt is behind it?" Moreau exhaled slowly. "I think Valacourt created something that someone else may now be carrying, intentionally or otherwise. And I think Paris, in its way, remembers him." "With all due respect, Patron," Janvier said gently, "you're starting to sound like some of the poets who haunt the riverside after too much absinthe." "Do poets evade pursuit under bridges?" Moreau asked sharply. Janvier blinked. "You followed someone?" "Yes." "And?" "He vanished." Janvier frowned. "Vanished how?" Moreau shook his head. "Not fast enough to be a runner, not slow enough to be a pedestrian. He was simply gone." Janvier rubbed the back of his neck. "A man who hums your melody and then disappears into thin air. Either he's playing with you or he's not working alone," Moreau finished. "Someone else knows the tune. Perhaps many people. The melody has escaped the box." Janvier sat, leaning his elbows on his knees. "The question is, why now?" Moreau walked to the window and stared across the courtyard, at the lights flickering in the neighboring offices. The reflection of the rain-slicked roofs shimmered like a distorted sheet of music. "Because the story that was locked in Rue des Trois Faucons," he said, "is no longer content to stay locked. Something has reopened it. Or someone." He turned back to Janvier. "I need you to search the public hospital records for any man fitting Valacourt's description who might have been admitted in the past decade, under any name, and search the morgues as well. I want to know if he lived or if he died." Janvier hesitated. "Understood." And what about the Lenoir? I'm going back there tonight, Moreau said quietly. Something is stirring in that house. Something that answered a melody before dawn. Janvier nodded slowly. You believe he's alive, don't you? Moreau paused, his face unreadable. I believe, he said, that a man can disappear, but his music cannot. The rain intensified again, tapping a familiar rhythm on the window, a rhythm that now echoed all across Paris. The fog that night lay over Paris like a heavy wool blanket, muffling the city's usual murmurs until even the distant carriages seemed to move like ghosts across stone. Inspector Moreau made his way toward Rue des Trois Faucons with a sense of inevitability pressing upon him, an intuition he did not dismiss. The rain had finally ceased, but the air held the smell of wet slate and cold iron. Each lamppost flickered weakly, its glow dissolving into the mist mere inches from its glass. It was the hour when Paris felt least certain of itself, when the boundaries between memory and the present thinned quietly. The Lenoir house stood in silhouette, its windows casting a faint amber light, as if someone inside still moved restlessly from room to room. Moreau paused at the gate. Something felt altered. The street was too still, too expectant, as though the shadows themselves had gathered to witness the night's unfolding. He approached the door and knocked once, the sound swallowed instantly by the fog. Elise opened the door almost immediately, her face drained, her hair loose around her shoulders as though she had been pacing anxiously. She stepped aside without a word. The moment Moreau crossed the threshold, he sensed the tension in the air. The house felt fuller tonight, not with people, but with something else, something that hovered at the edge of perception. She's in the parlor, Elise whispered, her voice trembling. She hasn't spoken in an hour. Moreau nodded, removed his hat, and moved down the dim hallway. The parlor door was ajar, and through the gap he saw Madame Lenoir sitting upright on the sofa, her hands folded tightly in her lap. Her face was pale, eyes fixed on the music box sitting on the table before her. It was open. Not a sound played from it, yet its presence seemed louder than any melody. Madame, Moreau said softly as he entered. She lifted her gaze slowly, as though forcing her eyes up from a great weight. Inspector, she whispered. It began again. When? He asked. Her fingers clenched slightly. Shortly after dusk. I heard it upstairs, but when I reached the landing, the melody had already ended. A moment later, I thought I heard footsteps behind me, she swallowed. But when I turned, no one was there. Moreau felt a subtle shift in the room's air, as though someone had brushed past him. He glanced toward the staircase. Shadows moved gently as the fog pressed against the windows. Elise, he asked, where were you when it happened? She approached cautiously. In the conservatory. I thought I saw someone in the courtyard. Just for a moment. A shape. Her breathing quickened. I wasn't imagining it. Moreau regarded both women, then turned to the music box. It sat innocently enough, but the scent rising from it was fresher than before, stronger, as though someone had just touched it. He closed the lid with a slow, deliberate motion. A faint click echoed through the room. Did either of you open this? He asked. Both shook their heads. Moreau took a slow breath. Then someone else is here. The lamps flickered. Elise gasped softly. He moved toward the staircase. Stay here. Whatever happens, do not follow unless I call. He climbed slowly, each step groaning under his weight. At the landing, the air felt denser, charged. He reached the corridor leading to the attic, noticing the faintest hint of motion at its far end. A shift of shadow, subtle but purposeful. He paused. The hallway held its breath. Valacourt, he said quietly into the silence. If you're here, you need not hide any longer. A whisper of movement brushed the attic door. Moreau approached it with steady steps. The key remained in its lock from earlier. He placed his hand on the knob. The wood felt faintly warm, as though touched not long before. He opened the door. The attic lay in darkness, except for the pale light filtering weakly through the narrow window. Dust motes floated lazily, disturbed by the opening of the door. Everything was as he had left it. The bed frame, the violin case, the desk. Yet the air felt heavier, the perfume stronger. Moreau stepped inside. There, a soft creak, like fabric shifting. He turned sharply. Nothing. Yet something in the room's shadows felt occupied, as though someone had just stepped out of sight. His gaze dropped to the floor. Footprints, fresh, leading from the window to the bed, and then, as he knelt to examine them, he heard it. The slightest vibration of strings, one trembling note, so delicate it was almost imagined. He turned sharply toward the violin case. It lay slightly open. He approached slowly, calm but alert. He lowered himself and lifted the lid further. The violin was gone. A sudden crash sounded below. Elise screaming. Moreau ran. He descended the stairs 2 at a time, landing in the hallway just as Elise stumbled backward into the wall, eyes wide with horror. Madame Lenoir stood rigid in the parlor doorway, her face contorted into something between shock and recognition. A figure stood in the center of the parlor, his back to them, coat dripping, head bowed slightly, violin in hand. Moreau sensed the stillness of the women behind him. He raised his voice carefully. "Turn around." The figure did so slowly. The man's face was pale but marked by time, hollows beneath the eyes, hair damp and streaked with gray, a tremor in the jaw. But beneath the wear of years, the outline of the man in the old letters was unmistakable. Adrien Vallecourt. Elise gasped. Madame Lenoir's knees buckled, but she steadied herself on the doorframe. Moreau held up a hand to keep them behind him. Vallecourt raised the violin slightly, as though in greeting or warning. "Inspector," he said softly. The voice was hoarse, fragile, yet unmistakably real. "You've been looking for me?" Moreau studied him closely. "You were in the attic." Vallecourt's lips twitched, almost a smile. "I've been many places in this house. It remembers me better than its owners do." Madame Lenoir broke then, stepping forward, tears streaming down her cheeks. "Adrien, you're alive." He looked at her gently, sorrowfully. "Yes, though I sometimes wonder whether I ought to have stayed dead. It would have been easier. For all of us." Elise looked between them, struggling to reconcile the living man with the ghost she had feared. "Why return now?" she whispered. Vallecourt's gaze fixed on her. "Because the melody awakened, and promises do not unbind themselves." Moreau stepped closer. "The music box. You designed it to play your message." Vallecourt nodded. "A code, a warning, something I was never meant to reveal, but I left it with her." He looked at Madame Lenoir. "Because I trusted her." "What does it mean?" Moreau asked. "The melody," Vallecourt said, "corresponds to a sequence, a ledger of sorts, tied to men whose names you know but cannot yet speak. Years ago, someone tried to take it from me. They believed I'd hidden it in my music. They were right." "So you ran?" Moreau asked. "I hid," Vallecourt corrected, "and when your husband confronted me, it became clear the danger would spill into the house. So I left." He lowered his gaze. "But a man cannot outrun his own creation." The rain began again, tapping the windows like an impatient hand. Elise whispered, "What happens now?" Moreau looked at all 3 of them. "Now," he said, "we finish this, but not here." A sharp crack shattered the moment. A gunshot from outside. Vallecourt stiffened. Elise cried out. Moreau turned toward the window. Shadows moved in the courtyard. "Get back," he ordered. The melody, faint but unmistakable, began to play again. Somewhere in the house. Not from the box. Not from the violin. From somewhere deeper. Somewhere someone else had just entered, and the night was no longer waiting.